The morning they decided to go into town to try on a wedding dress did not begin like any other day. There was no long discussion, no careful planning, no attempt to measure the risks or the consequences. Instead, the decision came quietly, almost naturally, as if it had always been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Toan woke before sunrise. The sky was still dark, a faint line of pale blue stretching along the horizon as the night slowly gave way to morning. The mountain air was cold, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. For a brief moment, everything felt still. Peaceful. Too peaceful. He sat up slowly, glancing toward the corner of the small wooden house where Tu Diem was still asleep. Her breathing was soft, steady, untouched by the weight that had been pressing down on both of them for days. Toan watched her in silence. There was something fragile about this moment. Something he didn't want to disturb. Because once the day began, reality would return, uncertainty, pressure, the invisible presence of a force that refused to let them live freely. But not today. Today, he made a decision. "We're going to town," he said softly when she finally opened her eyes. Tu Diem blinked, still half asleep. "Town? To try your wedding dress." For a second, she didn't respond. Then slowly, something changed in her expression. Not surprise. Not disbelief. Hope. A small, quiet hope that had been buried beneath days of tension and fear. "Are you serious?" she asked. Toan nodded. "We've waited long enough." The simplicity of his words carried more weight than anything else he could have said. They didn't need to discuss the risks. They both knew them. The stolen motorbike, the strangers in the village, the silent threats that lingered in the air, it was all still there. But so was something stronger. Their decision. The journey to town was not easy. Without the motorbike, they had to walk part of the way before catching a ride from an old truck that passed through the mountain road once every few hours. The road itself was narrow, winding along the edge of steep slopes, surrounded by dense forest and scattered patches of terraced fields. The truck driver didn't ask many questions. He simply glanced at them, nodded, and gestured for them to climb into the back. As the truck moved forward, the wind grew stronger, carrying dust and the distant scent of rain. Tu Diem sat beside Toan, holding onto the wooden side rail, her hair blowing across her face. She laughed once, softly, unexpectedly, as the truck hit a rough patch in the road. Toan looked at her. And for the first time in days, he saw something he had been afraid was disappearing. Joy. It was small. Fragile. But it was still there. And that was enough. The town was modest. A collection of low buildings, narrow streets, and small shops clustered together at the base of the mountain. It was far from the world Toan had once known, far from the towering glass buildings and endless noise of the city. But in some ways, it felt more real. More honest. They walked slowly through the streets, drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. Not because they looked unusual, but because there was something about them, something quiet but unmistakable, that caught attention. Maybe it was the way they stayed close to each other. Or the way they looked at things, as if trying to hold on to every detail. The bridal shop was easy to miss. It sat at the corner of a narrow street, its sign slightly faded, its window displaying a single white dress that had clearly been there for a long time. Tu Diem hesitated at the entrance. "This place, is it okay?" she asked softly. Toan smiled faintly. "It's more than okay." He pushed the door open. Inside, the shop was warm. Not luxurious. Not perfect. But welcoming. Soft light filtered through thin curtains, casting a gentle glow across the room. Dresses hung along the walls, simple, elegant, each one carrying its own quiet charm. An older woman stood behind a wooden counter, looking up as they entered. "You're here for a dress?" she asked. Tu Diem nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The woman studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Come with me." The first dress was simple. Too simple, Tu Diem thought. But when she stepped out from behind the curtain, everything changed. Toan looked up and forgot how to speak. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, focusing only on her. The way the fabric moved as she took a step forward. The way the light caught in her eyes. The way she looked at him, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with a quiet question. "What do you think?" she asked. Toan didn't answer right away. Because he couldn't. Not because the dress was perfect. But because she was. They tried more dresses after that. Some were slightly more detailed, others simpler still. Each one carried its own charm, its own quiet beauty. But none of them mattered in the way that first moment had. Because it wasn't about the dress. It never had been. It was about what it represented. A future. A promise. Something fragile, but real. At one point, Tu Diem stood in front of a small mirror, adjusting the edge of the dress carefully. Her fingers moved slowly, thoughtfully, as if trying to memorize the feeling. "Do you think this is enough?" she asked. Toan stepped closer. "Enough for what?" "For everything." He didn't hesitate this time. "It's more than enough." She turned to look at him. And in that moment, the uncertainty in her eyes softened. Not completely. But enough. Outside, the sky had begun to change. Clouds gathered slowly, covering the sunlight, casting a muted tone over the town. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a subtle tension that neither of them could fully ignore. Toan noticed it first. A car. Parked across the street. It hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had. He couldn't be sure. But something about it felt wrong. It didn't belong. "Is everything okay?" Tu Diem asked. Toan forced a small smile. "Yes." But his eyes remained on the window. Watching. Waiting. They finished choosing the dress not long after. It wasn't perfect. But it was theirs. And that was enough. As they stepped out of the shop, the air felt different. Heavier. The car was still there. This time, there was no doubt. Someone was inside. Watching. Toan felt it. That same familiar presence. The same silent pressure that had followed him from the mountains. From his past. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, he reached for Tu Diem's hand. And held it tightly. "Let's go," he said. The walk back felt longer. Quieter. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind, the footsteps, the distant rumble of vehicles. And behind them, something followed. Not close enough to be seen clearly. But close enough to be felt. Tu Diem sensed it too. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Because some things didn't need words. By the time they reached the road leading back to the mountains, the sky had darkened completely. The first drops of rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, soaking the ground, blurring the path ahead. Toan stopped for a moment. He turned back. The car was still there. This time, closer. No longer hiding. No longer pretending. Tu Diem tightened her grip on his hand. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she asked quietly. Toan looked at her. Then back at the road ahead. "No," he said. A pause. Then, "Neither are we." They kept walking. Through the rain. Through the uncertainty. Through everything that stood in their way. Because this was no longer just about a wedding. Or a dress. Or a single moment of happiness. It was about something much deeper. A choice. A line that had been drawn. And once crossed, there would be no turning back. Far behind them, the car's engine started. Slow. Deliberate. Following. And as the rain continued to fall, washing away the footprints they left behind, one thing became clear. This moment, this quiet, fragile day, was not the beginning of peace, but the calm. Before everything changed, the rain did not stop. If anything, it grew heavier, the drops hitting the ground with a steady, relentless rhythm, as if the sky itself refused to let this day end quietly. The road back to the mountains became slippery, the mud clinging to their shoes, slowing each step, but neither Toan nor Tu Diem said a word. They didn't need to. Because both of them knew. Something had already begun. Halfway up the mountain path, Toan suddenly stopped. Not because he was tired, but because the sound behind them had changed. The car. It was no longer keeping its distance. This time, the engine roared louder, closer, echoing through the narrow road that curved along the mountainside. Headlights cut through the rain and darkness, casting long, distorted shadows ahead of them. Tu Diem turned slowly. Her breath caught. They're coming closer. Toan stepped slightly in front of her, instinctively shielding her again, just as he had done so many times before. But this time, something was different. He didn't step back. He didn't hesitate. He stood his ground. The car slowed. Then stopped. Only a short distance away. The headlights remained on, blinding, impossible to see through. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No doors opened. No voices called out. Just silence. Heavy. Pressing. As if the entire world was holding its breath. Then, a door creaked open. A figure stepped out. Tall. Still. Unhurried. The rain fell harder, blurring the outline, but Toan didn't need to see clearly to understand. He already knew. This was not coincidence. This was not random. This was intentional. A message. The figure took one step forward. Then another. Stopping just at the edge of the light. Close enough to be seen. But still hidden in shadow. Tu Diem's fingers tightened around Toan's arm. "Who is that?" she whispered. Toan didn't answer. Because at that moment, a realization hit him with absolute clarity. This was no longer about warnings. No longer about fear. They had crossed a line the moment they chose not to turn back. And now, whoever stood in front of him had come to make sure they understood the cost of that choice. The wind howled louder. The rain blurred everything. And as the figure slowly lifted their head, the story did not end. It only stepped into something far more dangerous. Because this time, there would be no more distance. No more waiting. Only confrontation. And whatever came next would decide everything.